No one in the kingdom was allowed to speak of what happened that winter night. Not the guards who stood outside the chamber. Not the servants who cleaned the blood from the stone floor. Not even the priest who left the room pale and trembling before dawn. But you were the one person the king chose to keep the truth alive. And for the rest of your life, it would follow you through every silent corridor, every whispered conversation, every sleepless night inside the cold walls of the castle. Because some secrets do not protect a kingdom. Some secrets bury it slowly, 1 year at a time. The fire in the Western Tower had nearly died by the time they came for you. Only a few weak flames still moved inside the iron basin beside your bed, throwing long shadows across the stone walls of your chamber. Outside, somewhere far beyond the narrow castle windows, winter rain struck the rooftops in slow, uneven rhythms. The sound drifted through the dark like distant footsteps. You had been asleep only briefly, not deeply enough to dream, just enough to forget where you were for a few peaceful moments. Then came the knocking. 3 slow strikes against the wooden door. Not loud, not urgent, which somehow made them worse. You opened your eyes into darkness and listened carefully, waiting for another sound. For a moment, nothing came except the rain and the faint groan of wind moving through the old castle corridors. Then the knocking returned. 3 more times. You sat up slowly beneath the wool blankets, your body stiff from the cold. The castle fires had been burning weakly for weeks now. Winter had settled deep into the kingdom earlier than expected, and even the servants whispered that the cold felt unnatural this year. Another silence followed. Then a voice. "Wake yourself," the man outside said quietly. "You are being summoned." At once, the last traces of sleep disappeared from your body. No one was summoned at this hour unless something terrible had happened. You pushed the blankets aside and stood carefully on the freezing stone floor. The cold climbed instantly through your bare feet and into your bones. For a moment you simply stood there, listening to the storm beyond the walls and the faint crackling of dying firelight. Then you reached for your cloak. Your hands trembled slightly as you fastened it around your shoulders. Not from fear, at least not yet. Inside the castle, fear rarely arrived all at once. It entered slowly, quietly, like winter creeping beneath a locked door. You crossed the chamber and pulled the door open. A royal guard waited outside holding a lantern low beside his leg. Golden light moved softly across the corridor stones, revealing dust drifting through the cold air. The guard did not meet your eyes. That unsettled you immediately. Most men in the castle avoided eye contact only when carrying bad news or dangerous orders. "The king requests your presence," he said. "Requests, not commands." That word stayed with you. The king did not request things from people like you. You were not a nobleman, not a knight, not even an advisor important enough to stand near the throne during court assemblies. You were little more than a quiet servant of records, a man trusted to copy letters, organize royal documents, and keep his mouth shut when powerful men argued behind closed doors. Invisible, that was your true role inside the castle. And invisible men often survived longer than proud ones. You followed the guard into the corridor. The castle felt different at night. During the day, the halls were filled with movement. Servants carrying water, cooks shouting through kitchen smoke, armored soldiers crossing between towers. But now the corridors stood nearly silent except for the distant howl of wind outside. Your footsteps echoed softly against the stone. The lantern light trembled with each movement. Somewhere far below, a heavy door slammed shut. You glanced toward the sound instinctively. The guard kept walking. Neither of you spoke again. As you descended deeper into the castle, the air grew colder. The warmth from the upper towers disappeared behind you, replaced by damp stone and the faint smell of wet iron. You knew these lower corridors well. Very few servants came here willingly. The king's private chambers rested beyond this section of the castle, hidden behind guarded halls where whispers traveled faster than truth. That was where the powerful made decisions, and where dangerous things disappeared. You turned another corner, then another. First, nothing seemed unusual. Then you noticed the blood. Not much, just dark stains smeared across the edge of the stone floor near the wall. Partially cleaned. Your steps slowed. The guard noticed but said nothing. A little farther ahead, two servants knelt silently beside wooden buckets filled with dark water. Neither man looked up as you passed them. One scrubbed the floor with desperate focus while the other emptied fresh water across the stones with shaking hands. The metallic smell in the corridor suddenly became stronger. Blood. Fresh blood. Your stomach tightened. Still, the guard continued forward without explanation. That frightened you more than the blood itself. Because inside royal castles, silence was never accidental. And tonight, the entire castle seemed to be holding its breath. The guard finally stopped before a narrow wooden door reinforced with black iron bands. Unlike the great doors used for ceremonies or royal gatherings, this one was plain, almost forgotten looking, the kind of door servants passed every day without noticing. But two armed men stood outside it with their hands resting nervously on their swords. Neither spoke as you approached. Neither moved. Rainwater dripped quietly from one guard's cloak onto the stones below. For a brief moment, all you could hear was the sound of water and breathing. Then the guard beside you pushed the door open. Warm air rolled out from the chamber inside, carrying the smell of smoke, melted wax, and something bitter beneath it. Medicine. You stepped forward carefully. The room was smaller than you expected for a royal chamber. Circular walls surrounded a low fire burning inside a sunken hearth. Shelves filled with old maps and sealed scrolls covered the stone around you. Heavy curtains blocked the windows from the storm outside, allowing only faint traces of wind to enter the room. Like a system that had successfully replaced one component first and resumed operation without interruption. Not because of his face, who you were before, because of how small he felt less relevant with every passing second. The king had once been a man whose presence alone silenced unnecessary. Even years ago, the journal, when age had already begun bending his shoulders and whitening his beard, the silence did not feel like lowered their eyes when he entered the hall. Felt like acceptance. But now the figure before you seemed diminished somehow, fragile, like winter itself had hollowed him out from within. A thick fur blanket covered his legs. One trembling hand rested near the arm of his chair, while the other gripped a silver cup so tightly you thought it might slip from his fingers at any moment. His eyes lifted toward you slowly. Sharp eyes. Still alive. Still dangerous. "You arrived quickly," he said softly. His voice sounded weaker than you remembered. You lowered your head immediately. "My king." The guards behind you closed the door. The sound echoed heavily through the chamber. Then came silence again. Not ordinary silence. The kind that makes a man suddenly aware of his own heartbeat. The king studied you for several long seconds without speaking. The fire crackled between you, casting restless shadows across the room. Finally, he gestured weakly toward the empty chair opposite him. "Sit." You hesitated, not because you wished to refuse, because you had never been invited to sit in the king's private presence before. The hesitation did not escape him. "That was not a test," the king murmured. "Sit down before I die waiting." Very carefully, you lowered yourself into the chair. The wood felt cold despite the fire. Up close, the king looked even worse. His skin had turned pale beneath the firelight, and deep shadows rested beneath his eyes. Tiny tremors moved through his fingers every few seconds, subtle enough that most men might not notice them. But you noticed details for a living. That was why they trusted you with records, and perhaps why you had been brought here tonight. The king leaned back slowly, breathing harder than such a small movement should have required. "You know why men fear this castle?" he asked suddenly. The question caught you off guard. You chose your answer carefully. "Because power lives here." A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "No," he whispered. "Men fear this castle because truth dies here." The fire shifted loudly. Somewhere above, thunder rolled through the distant sky. You remained silent. The king seemed pleased by that. "There are men in this kingdom," he continued, "who believe wars are won with armies. Others believe kingdoms survive through gold, or faith, or bloodlines." His eyes settled directly onto yours. "They are all wrong." He coughed suddenly, a deep, painful sound that bent his body forward. Dark liquid spotted the cloth pressed against his mouth before he slowly lowered it again. For the first time that night, you realized the king was dying. Not someday, not eventually, soon. The realization chilled you more deeply than the winter air ever could. The king noticed your expression immediately. "Yes," he said quietly. "Now you understand why you were summoned." A long silence followed. Outside, rain battered the castle walls harder now, as if the storm itself had moved closer. The king reached beside his chair and lifted a small object wrapped carefully in dark cloth. He held it for several seconds without speaking, almost reluctantly. Then he placed it onto the table between you. You stared at it. A journal, old, worn at the edges, bound with faded leather cracked by time. "There is a truth inside this book," the king said, "that cannot survive my death." You looked up slowly. "My king," but he raised one weak hand, stopping you immediately. No questions yet. His breathing had become uneven now, painfully uneven. "You were chosen because men forget you when you leave a room," he continued. "That sounds cruel. It is not meant to be." His eyes narrowed slightly. "It is a gift." The fire crackled softly beside you. "You have no ambition," he said. "No hunger for titles. No powerful family waiting to use you. Men speak freely around you because they believe you are harmless." Another silence settled over the chamber. Then the king leaned closer. "And harmless men," he whispered, "are the only ones who can be trusted with dangerous truths." You glanced once more toward the journal resting between you. Something deep inside your chest told you not to touch it. Not yet, perhaps not ever, because already, without knowing its contents, you could feel the weight it carried. And somewhere beneath that growing weight came a terrifying realization. Whatever waited inside that book had already destroyed the old man sitting before you. Not through war, not through poison, but slowly, year by year, secret by secret, until there was almost nothing left of him. You did not touch the journal immediately. For several seconds, you simply stared at it resting between the two of you while the fire shifted quietly inside the hearth. The king watched your hesitation carefully. "Good," his expression seemed to say. A man too eager to open forbidden things was never the right man to trust. "You already feel it, don't you?" he asked softly. Your eyes lifted toward him. "The weight of it." You said nothing, but silence, you had learned long ago, was often an answer by itself. Outside the chamber walls, the storm continued deepening over the castle. Wind pressed against the narrow windows with long hollow moans, and somewhere in the distance thunder rolled across the mountains beyond the kingdom. The king leaned back weakly into his chair. "When I was younger," he murmured, "I believed truth was a clean thing, bright, simple. I thought honest men slept better than liars." A bitter smile crossed his face. "You eventually learn otherwise." His breathing rattled faintly now. His breathing rattled faintly now. You could hear it beneath every sentence. "This kingdom," he continued slowly, "was not built through honor. No kingdom ever is. Men simply create stories afterward so they may live with themselves." The firelight flickered across the old scars on his hands. For the first time, you noticed how exhausted he truly looked. Not merely sick, burdened, like a man who had spent years dragging something invisible behind him. The king's eyes drifted briefly toward the journal. "I once believed I could carry it alone," he whispered. That was my greatest mistake. You swallowed carefully. My king, if this truth is so dangerous, why preserve it at all? The question escaped before you could stop it. For a moment, the room fell completely still. Then the king gave a low, tired laugh. Because destroying truth is far more dangerous than hiding it. Again, silence settled between you. The king's gaze moved toward the fire as though seeing something far beyond the chamber walls. You know what fear truly is? He asked. You waited. It is not death. Death is simple. His voice lowered almost to a whisper. Fear is becoming responsible for the collapse of everything around you. The storm outside cracked violently with thunder. The sound shook dust softly from the ceiling stones. The king closed his eyes briefly as if gathering strength. Then finally, he spoke the words that would divide your life forever into before and after. The man buried beneath the royal cathedral, he whispered, was never the true king. Your chest tightened instantly. The room suddenly felt smaller, warmer, harder to breathe inside. You stared at him, uncertain whether you had misunderstood. But the king continued before you could speak. My brother died 32 years ago during the winter campaign in the north. The arrow pierced his throat before sunrise. His eyes remained fixed on the fire. Only 5 men witnessed it. You felt your pulse beginning to quicken. The kingdom would have fractured if the truth escaped, he continued. The nobles were already preparing for civil war. Half the armies despised my bloodline. The church threatened rebellion. Foreign kingdoms waited like wolves beyond our borders. The king coughed again, harsher this time. Dark stains spread slowly across the cloth in his hand. So we buried him quietly, he said. And before dawn, I became him. The fire cracked loudly between you. For a moment you forgot the cold, forgot the storm, forgot even the chamber itself. Because the old man before you was not merely confessing deception. He was confessing that the kingdom itself had been living inside a lie for 3 decades. Every law, every execution, every war, every prayer spoken in the royal family's name, built upon a dead man's identity. Your eyes drifted slowly toward the journal. The king noticed. Everything is written there, he said quietly. Names, witnesses, dates, letters, proof. His voice hardened faintly. If ambitious men ever possessed that book, this kingdom would tear itself apart before winter's end. You tried speaking, failed. Your mouth had gone dry. The king studied your face carefully now, almost as if measuring whether regret had already begun growing inside you. It had. You understood suddenly why the guards outside avoided your eyes, why the servants scrubbed blood from the floor, why fear seemed to hang through the castle tonight like smoke. Because the moment this truth entered your mind, you became part of it, and secrets like this did not allow witnesses to leave unchanged. The king slowly pushed the journal closer toward you across the table. You are wondering why I do not simply burn it. You looked up carefully. Yes, because lies decay, he whispered. Eventually someone uncovers them. Always. His fingers tightened weakly around the arm of his chair. But if the truth survives in careful hands, then perhaps one day it may emerge without destroying everything. Another silence, longer this time. The storm outside had softened slightly now into steady rain tapping against stone and glass. Somewhere far away, castle bells rang once through the darkness. Midnight, the king heard them too. A strange sadness entered his expression. When those bells ring tomorrow, he murmured, the kingdom will wake believing its king still honorable. His eyes met yours again. You must help keep it that way. You felt cold despite the fire, because now the true horror finally revealed itself. You were not being asked to protect a man. You were being asked to protect a lie large enough to hold an entire kingdom together. And somewhere deep beneath your growing fear came another realization. If this secret truly required protection after the king's death, then anyone else who knew it might already be marked for silence. The thought entered your mind quietly, but once it arrived, it refused to leave. The bells continued echoing faintly through the castle long after midnight had passed. Neither of you spoke for some time. Rain slid softly against the chamber windows while the fire collapsed inward piece by piece, sending brief bursts of sparks into the darkness. The king seemed lost somewhere far beyond the room now, his tired eyes fixed on the flames as though searching through the years behind them. You could not stop staring at the journal. It rested silently on the table between you, small, ordinary, and yet it carried enough weight to destroy crowns. Your thoughts had already begun turning against themselves. Who else knew? How many men had died protecting this lie? How many had been killed because they knew too much? The king suddenly spoke again without looking at you. You are afraid now. It was not a question. You answered honestly. Yes. A weak smile touched his face. Good. Fear keeps men alive longer than courage ever will. His breathing had become noticeably worse. Each inhale sounded shallow and strained now, followed by long pauses that made you wonder if another breath would come at all. The others were not afraid enough, he murmured. Your eyes lifted instantly. The others. For the first time that night, uncertainty crossed the king's face. A dangerous uncertainty, as though he had already said more than intended. But exhaustion seemed to loosen his caution now. There were 5 men besides myself who knew the truth after my brother died, he said quietly. A physician, 2 knights, priest, and the chancellor. The fire cracked softly. They swore loyalty before God himself. His eyes darkened. 3 are buried now. A chill moved through you. The physician died first. Fever, they claimed. The king coughed painfully into his cloth again. Then one knight disappeared during a hunting journey near the eastern forests. His voice lowered further. The priest survived longest. You remained perfectly still. The king finally looked directly at you again. He drank poison 7 years ago. The chamber suddenly felt colder. Not because of the winter, because of the silence surrounding those deaths. No outright, no investigations, no grieving, only quiet endings. You realized something terrible then. The king himself no longer fully believed those deaths had been accidents. Perhaps he never had. You think someone else discovered the truth, you said carefully. The old man's eyes returned to the fire. I think secrets behave like wounds, he whispered. No matter how tightly you bind them, eventually they bleed through. Another long pause followed. The storm outside had weakened now into distant rain and wind. Somewhere in the castle above, faint footsteps crossed a corridor before fading again into silence. The king leaned forward slowly, wincing from the effort. You must understand something before dawn arrives, he said. His voice had changed, less weary now, more urgent. The kingdom cannot survive another succession crisis. You knew enough history to understand what he meant. Civil wars had begun for far less. If the truth escaped, that the beloved king buried beneath the cathedral was not truly the man history remembered, then every noble family with distant claims to the throne would rise against the crown. Armies would split, cities would burn, foreign rulers would invade before the kingdom finished tearing itself apart. Tens of thousands could die because of a truth hidden inside one small journal. The king studied your expression carefully. You see it now. You nodded slowly, and that frightened you more than anything else, because part of you had already begun accepting the burden, already begun calculating the consequences, already stepping into the prison built for you tonight. The king noticed. That is how it begins, he whispered. You frowned slightly. My king. He gave a tired smile that held no comfort inside it. At first you carry the secret because you are ordered to. Then you carry it because others depend upon it. Then one day, his eyes drifted toward the dark windows. You realize you no longer remember who you were before it. The fire dimmed lower. Shadows deepened across the chamber walls. For a moment, neither of you spoke again. Then suddenly, a sharp knock struck the chamber door. You flinched instinctively. The king did not. "Enter," he called weakly. The door opened slowly. A tall man stepped inside wearing dark robes trimmed with silver thread. Though age had thinned his hair and bent his posture slightly, his eyes remained alert beneath the candlelight. The Chancellor. You recognized him immediately, one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, and according to the king's confession, one of the few remaining witnesses to the lie. The Chancellor's gaze landed on you first, not surprised, not curious, evaluating. Then his eyes moved toward the journal resting on the table. A flicker of emotion crossed his face so quickly you almost missed it. Concern. The king spoke before either of you could. "You took your time. The physicians delayed me," the Chancellor replied calmly. "They believe your majesty should rest." A faint smile touched the king's lips. "I will soon have all the rest I require." The Chancellor did not react to the joke. Instead, his attention settled once more onto you. And in that moment, something inside your chest tightened. Because unlike the king's exhausted sadness, the Chancellor's eyes contained calculation. Cold calculation, the kind worn by men who survive royal courts for decades. He approached the table slowly. "You told him?" he asked quietly. The king nodded once. Silence followed. Heavy silence. Then the Chancellor lowered his eyes toward the journal again. "You should not have done that tonight," he said. The king's expression hardened faintly. There was no more time. The Chancellor remained still for several long seconds. Then finally, he looked directly at you, and although his voice stayed polite, something beneath it unsettled you deeply. "Do you understand?" he asked softly. "What now depends upon your silence?" The Chancellor did not move closer. He simply stood there, watching you as if you were no longer a servant, but a problem that had just entered the room. "You understand what now depends upon your silence?" he repeated. The king did not answer for you this time. Instead, he closed his eyes briefly, as if tired of repeating the same truth in different forms. But you understood. Silence was no longer a choice. It was a condition for survival. The journal on the table suddenly felt heavier than before. Not physically, but in meaning, like it had shifted from object to consequence. The Chancellor finally walked closer and stopped beside the table, not sitting, not touching anything. "You have been told enough for one night," he said calmly. "More than enough." The king opened his eyes again. "There is no such thing as enough with this truth," he replied quietly. A pause. Then the Chancellor spoke again, lower this time. "Then let me be clearer than him." His gaze locked onto yours. "If this leaves this room in any form, you will not survive long enough to regret it." No anger in his voice. That was what made it real. You had heard threats before, from soldiers, from angry nobles, from men pretending power. But this was different. This was administrative. Final, like a law already written. The king coughed again, harder now, bending forward slightly. When he straightened, his face looked paler than before. "You see," he said weakly, "this is what the truth creates, even among those who built it." The Chancellor did not deny it. That silence confirmed more than words could. You looked down at the journal again, and for the first time, a thought formed that had nothing to do with duty or fear, only structure. If this truth survives, the kingdom collapses. If it dies, you become its keeper. Either way, you do not leave this room the same person. The fire cracked sharply, breaking the silence for a moment. Then the Chancellor spoke one last time. "Choose carefully," he said. Because from this moment onward, there is no version of your life where you were never here. The king motioned weakly toward the journal again. Take it, he said. You hesitated. Not because you refused, because accepting it made everything irreversible in a way words had not yet made real. Slowly, you reached forward. Your fingers touched the leather cover. Cold, dry, unforgiving. The moment you lifted it, something subtle changed in the room. Not physically, but in attention. Both men watched you differently now. Not as a servant, not as a witness, as a holder, carrier. The king leaned back, exhaling slowly. From this point, he said, you are not outside this truth anymore. A long pause followed. Outside, the rain continued, softer now, almost gentle, as if the world itself was unaware of what had just been decided inside this chamber. The chancellor finally turned slightly toward the door. You should leave before dawn, he said. Not advice, procedure. You looked at him. Where would I go? He paused for a fraction of a second, then answered, anywhere that does not ask questions about kings. The king gave a faint, tired sound that might have been a laugh, or regret. You held the journal tighter, and understood something very clearly. This was not the moment the secret began. This was the moment it began to own you. The chancellor left without another word. The door closed behind him with a soft, controlled sound that felt far heavier than it should have. Not a slam, not a threat, just finality, and that was somehow worse. The king did not watch him leave. Instead, he kept his eyes on you, as if the room now only contained 2 variables instead of 3. You are holding it, he said quietly. You realized your hands were still gripping the journal. Too tightly. You loosened your fingers slightly, but did not let go. The king noticed. Good, he murmured. Do not treat it like paper. Treat it like weight. That is what it is. A pause. Then softer. And what it will become for you. The fire had begun to collapse further now, reducing the chamber to dim orange shadows and dark corners that felt deeper than they should be. You looked down at the journal, still closed, still silent, but now it felt awake, as if it had been waiting for your touch longer than you had been alive. You still have a chance, the king said suddenly. You looked up. For what? His eyes lingered on you for a moment. To leave this room and forget everything you heard. The words hung in the air. Simple. Impossible. The king continued. I can order it. The chancellor will ensure your disappearance is quiet. Your life will continue elsewhere. A small settlement. A new identity. No questions. A pause. Then he added, but you will never truly leave it. That sentence landed harder than the threat, because it was honest. Truth, once seen, does not leave men clean. You lowered your gaze again. What happens if I refuse? You asked. The king did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked tired, not like a ruler now, like someone who had already lived through every possible version of this conversation. Then you carry it, he said finally, until it kills you, or until you learn to become it. The words did not feel dramatic. They felt like instruction, the kind men give when they already know the outcome. Outside, wind pressed harder against the windows again, as if reacting to the room itself. The castle above groaned faintly under the storm. Time felt unclear now, not in hours, but in direction, as if everything had started moving towards something inevitable. You stood still, holding the journal. Then you asked the question you should not have asked. If I open it? The king interrupted immediately. No. One word. Sharp. Final. Not angry. Protective. His eyes hardened slightly. You do not open it here. Pause. Not in this room. Not in this castle. You frowned slightly. Then where? The king hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty returned to his expression. Not about the truth, about consequences. Finally, he spoke. There is a place beneath the Western Foundation. Old storage tunnels, forgotten even by most servants. The fire flickered. There you will read it. You stared at him. Alone. He nodded slowly. Yes. The words settled into the room like a stone dropped into deep water. Then he added, because once you begin, there is no version of you that remains unchanged by witnesses. That was the most honest thing he had said all night, and somehow, the most frightening. A long silence followed. Only rain, fire, and the distant pressure of the castle around you. Then the king leaned back slightly, eyes closing for a moment. You should go now, he said, not dismissing, not ending, simply allowing motion to resume. The chamber had become too small for stillness. You turned toward the door, but stopped, looked back once. The king was watching you, not as a servant, not as a subject, but as the last point in a chain he could no longer control. And for the first time since entering the room, you understood something clearly. This was no longer about protecting a secret. It was about becoming its next owner. You stepped out. The door closed behind you, and the castle corridor greeted you with silence that felt different now. Not empty, but waiting. The corridor outside the chamber felt colder than before. Not physically at first, but in the way silence now carried meaning. Every step you took echoed slightly differently, as if the castle itself had begun listening. You kept the journal close to your chest, not because you feared losing it, but because it felt like it might change temperature if you let it go. Behind you, the chamber door remained closed. No guards followed immediately. That detail stayed in your mind longer than it should have, because it meant something simple. You were not being escorted anymore. You were being allowed to move. And in places like this, permission often replaced restraint. You passed through the same corridors you had walked earlier, but now they felt altered. The blood on the stone floor had been partially cleaned, but not fully erased. Smears remained in the cracks, like memory refusing to disappear completely. Servants avoided your gaze as you passed. Not fear exactly, recognition, as if your shape in their world had already changed, even if nothing visible had happened yet. A heavy door at the end of the corridor stood slightly open. Beyond it, the lower stairwell descended into darkness. No torch had been lit here. You hesitated, then stepped inside. The moment you crossed the threshold, sound changed. The storm above became distant, muted, like it belonged to another world. Only your footsteps remained, slow, measured, careful. The stairs were old stone, worn down by centuries of movement that no one remembered anymore. The air grew damp as you descended, carrying the smell of earth and old timber. With each step downward, the castle above felt less like a building, and more like something sitting on top of you. The journal shifted slightly in your arms, or maybe you imagined it. At the bottom of the stairwell, a narrow passage stretched forward, barely wide enough for two men to walk side by side. You moved into it, and for the first time since leaving the chamber, you were completely alone. The silence here was different, not empty, intentional, as if the castle had stopped speaking to you and started observing instead. You continued forward until you reached a small iron gate. Unlocked. That detail again. Allowed access instead of restricted. You pushed it open, creaked softly. Inside was a room that had clearly not been used in years. Stone walls, old storage shelves, broken crates stacked in corners. And at the center, a single wooden table, waiting. No guards, no candles, no instructions, only space. You placed the journal on the table slowly. It made a soft sound as it touched the wood. For a moment, you did nothing, just stood there, listening to nothing. Then you realized something important. No one had followed you. No one was coming, which meant the decision was no longer being guided. It was yours now, completely. The thought should have felt like freedom. It did not. It felt like abandonment. You reached out and opened the journal. The leather resisted slightly, as if it had been sealed by time rather than ink. The first page was not what you expected. No title, no signature, only a single line written in careful, controlled handwriting. If you are reading this, then the lie has already outlived its maker. You stared at it for a long time, then turned the page, as if the writer had once been careful, and then slowly started writing like someone who no longer expected to be alive long enough to finish sentences. You turned another page, then another. Names appeared, not grand titles, not legends, just ordinary names. Knights, clerks, physician, priest, and beside each name, a short note. Removed, silenced, relocated, confirmed quiet. No explanations, no emotion, just outcomes. Your stomach tightened slightly as the pattern became obvious. These were not stories. They were records, evidence of control, not of a kingdom's strength, but of how far it had gone to preserve itself. You flipped faster now. The journal stopped behaving like history and started feeling like accounting. Then you saw it. A page marked with a different tone. Slower handwriting. Heavier ink strokes. The crown does not rest on truth or lies. It rests on what people are allowed to believe long enough to die for it. You stopped. Read it again. That sentence stayed with you longer than anything else so far, because it explained everything without explaining anything at all. No misteri, just structure, a system. You continued. The deeper you went, the more the entries changed. Not just names now, events, small adjustments to history, a battle that ended sooner than recorded, a rebellion that never gained support, a treaty that was signed under different conditions than remembered. Each correction small alone. Together, they rewrote reality. Your grip tightened on the journal. Not fear now, something worse. Understanding. Footsteps suddenly echoed faintly from the stairwell outside the room. You froze instantly. The sound stopped. Silence returned. You waited. Nothing. Still, you looked toward the entrance. Empty. But the awareness remained. You were no longer completely outside the system described in the journal. You were inside it. You turned another page quickly. This one was different. Only a single paragraph. If the reader has reached this point without interruption, then the Chancellor has failed his duty. Your breath stopped for a fraction of a second. And for the first time tonight, you realized something had been monitoring this process long before you agreed to it. Not watching the kingdom, watching the truth itself. The journal was not just history, it was a controlled transmission, and you were now inside its final phase. You did not turn the page immediately. Your eyes stayed on the sentence long enough for it to stop feeling like ink and start feeling like intent. If the reader has reached this point without interruption, so interruption was expected, planned, counted for, which meant everything you experienced so far, the guards, the Chancellor, even the King's timing, was not improvised. It was structured, like a system designed around your presence. The journal was no longer just a record. It was a sequence, and you were inside it. A faint sound came again from the stairwell, this time closer. Not footsteps, something softer, cloth against stone. You turned your head slightly toward the entrance. Still nothing visible, but the feeling of being observed sharpened. You looked back down at the page and forced yourself to continue. The next entry was dated, not with a year, with a condition. Day 1 after substitution confirmed. Your eyes narrowed slightly. Substitution, not succession, not inheritance. Substitution. You read further. Public perception stabilized within acceptable deviation. Noble resistance minimal. Religious institutions compliant under revised doctrine framing. Your mind tried to translate it into simpler terms. Failed. Because the language was not emotional. It was administrative, as if a kingdom were not a living place, but a managed structure. You turned the page faster now. Another entry, shorter, more urgent in tone. 3 witnesses removed beyond threshold influence range. Your chest tightened again. Removed, not executed, not punished. Removed, like correcting an error in a system. You closed your eyes for a moment, not because you were tired, because your mind was starting to build connections you did not want it to build. The king had said 5 men knew. Now the journal confirmed their disappearance. Not accidents, not coincidence, procedure. A sudden realization formed in your mind. You were not the first person to sit where you were sitting, and every previous reader had likely reached the same point. You opened your eyes again. The journal continued. If stabilization continues, truth containment layer will no longer require direct royal maintenance. Your fingers slowed. Containment layer. That phrase did not belong in a medieval court. It belonged in something larger, more deliberate, more engineered. The room around you suddenly felt less like a forgotten storage chamber and more like a node inside something vast and unseen. Another sound came from the stairwell, closer again, still not entering, waiting. You realized something else then. The longer you stayed here, the less control you had over who arrived. You turned the page, and this time the writing changed completely. Different pressure, different rhythm, as if the author had been interrupted while writing. If you are not alone while reading this, stop immediately. You froze, slowly looked toward the entrance again. Still nothing visible, but now the silence felt occupied, like space had been filled without sound. You looked back at the journal, and for the first time, you hesitated to continue, because whatever came next was no longer just information. It was the point where the system either accepted you or corrected you. You turned the page anyway. The journal no longer felt like something you were reading. It felt like something that was reading you back. Each page you turned carried less explanation and more implication. The structure was collapsing into something tighter now, less history, more consequence. You tried to focus on the most recent entry. Containment breach probability increasing due to secondary awareness. You stopped. Secondary awareness. That phrase did not belong in any world you understood. You looked toward the stairwell again. Still no visible movement. But now you were no longer relying on sight to confirm presence. Something was there. You turned another page. This one was almost empty. Only a few lines. Reader integration initiated. Identity divergence detected. Stabilization required. Your grip tightened. Integration. Not information. Not discovery. Integration. That word shifted everything, because it suggested the journal was not meant to be understood. It was meant to be absorbed. Behind you, a faint sound finally broke the silence. Footsteps, not approaching fast, controlled, measured, like someone who already knew exactly where you were standing. You turned slowly. At the edge of the stairwell entrance, a figure stood partially in shadow. Not the king, not the chancellor, a different presence. Guerin no visible insignia. No clear allegiance, just stillness, as if they had been waiting longer than you had been reading. You did not speak. Neither did they. The silence between you felt structured now. Not empty, designed. Then the figure finally moved one step forward and spoke quietly. You should not have reached this page. Not a threat. A confirmation. Like a system detecting an error that must now be corrected. Your eyes flicked briefly to the journal on the table, then back to the figure. For the first time since entering the castle, you understood the most important part of the king's secret. It was never about hiding a truth. It was about controlling who could survive learning it. and you had just crossed the point where survival was no longer guaranteed. The figure at the stairwell did not move closer. That was the first detail that felt wrong. Not the presence itself, but the restraint. Most threats, in your experience, revealed their intent through motion. Even hesitation had a rhythm, but this person stood outside that rhythm entirely, as if they were not participating in time the same way you were. Your hand remained near the journal without touching it. The silence stretched. Then the figure spoke again. You are not supposed to interpret it yet. You frowned slightly. Then what am I supposed to do? A pause, almost imperceptible. Continue. That answer made something uncomfortable settle in your chest, because it implied obedience was still part of the system, just not in the way you thought. You glanced down at the journal again. The pages felt heavier now, not physically, but in expectation. Like the next line you read would not just inform you, but reposition you. Slowly, you turned back to the last entry. Your eyes scanned it again. Stabilization required. Then the realization formed cleanly. Stabilization was not about the kingdom. It was about you. A sound echoed faintly from above. Far, distorted, like a bell struck through layers of stone and distance. The castle reacting, not emotionally, structurally. The figure finally stepped fully into the room. Their face became partially visible under the weak light. Not a soldier, not a noble, something more neutral, like an administrator of outcomes. You have been recorded, they said. No emotion in it, just fact. Your throat tightened slightly. By who? The figure tilted their head a fraction. The system you entered when you touched the journal. Quiet pause. Then they added, it does not belong to the king anymore. That sentence landed differently, because it removed the illusion of ownership. The king was not controlling the secret. He was maintaining it. There was a difference, a dangerous one. You stepped back slightly from the table without realizing it. The journal remained exactly where you left it, but now it felt less like an object you had found and more like a position you had taken. The figure continued calmly. You are at the transition point. Your eyes narrowed. Transition to what? A longer pause this time. Then, replacement or removal. The room felt smaller again, not physically, conceptually, as if possibilities were collapsing. You looked down at the journal one more time and understood something simple and absolute. The king had not chosen you to protect a secret. He had chosen you to see whether the secret could survive you. The figure turned slightly toward the stairwell. Decide quickly, they said, before the castle decides for you. And for the first time since this began, you felt time stop being passive and start becoming pressure. The figure stepped back toward the stairwell again, but this time they did not leave. They simply remained at the threshold, as if their position was fixed between two states, inside and outside, observer and participant. You realized something unsettling. They were not guarding the room. They were containing it. The journal lay open on the table, untouched for several seconds now. That stillness felt unnatural, as if the system itself was waiting for your next action to define what kind of outcome would follow. You finally spoke. If I stop reading, what happens? The figure did not answer immediately. When they did, their voice was lower. Then you remain incomplete. Pause. And incomplete things are corrected eventually. The word corrected did not feel like punishment. It felt like maintenance, like removing an error from a structure that could not tolerate instability. Your eyes drifted again to the journal. The idea formed clearly now. Every person who had reached this point before you had likely asked the same question, and none of them were present in this room now. You turned a page, not because you wanted to, because stopping felt structurally unsafe. The next entry was shorter than the previous ones, almost minimal. Subject shows adaptive comprehension, emotional resistance decreasing, Containment window narrowing. You stopped at that last line. Containment window, not imprisonment, not control. A window implied timing, a period during which something was allowed to exist before intervention. Your existence here was not permanent. It was scheduled. Behind you, the figure spoke again. You are not the first to read it fully. That sentence froze you. You slowly turned your head. They continued. But you are the first to remain conscious after understanding it. A cold realization settled in. So the others had not failed at reading. They had failed at surviving comprehension. The journal was not a secret document. It was a filter, a mechanism designed to separate those who could carry the structure from those who would destabilize it. You looked down at the pages again, and for the first time the fear changed shape. It was no longer about death. It was about what kind of continuation was allowed after understanding. The figure finally stepped fully away from the stairwell. One final instruction, they said. Your eyes lifted. Choose what you become before the system chooses for you. Silence followed. Heavy, not empty, decisive. The journal remained open in front of you. And somewhere deep inside the castle, something large and unseen had already begun adjusting to your presence inside its structure. The journal did not turn the page this time, turned itself. A faint shift in the air preceded it, like the room acknowledging that a threshold had been crossed. The figure at the stairwell stopped moving entirely, not because they were waiting, because waiting was no longer part of their role. You are at the end of observation, they said quietly. You looked up. The end of what? You asked. But you already knew the answer would not be simple. The figure stepped forward once, just once, and for the first time the tone changed. Not mechanical, not administrative, human almost. Every system that preserves truth eventually reaches a point where it must decide what to do with those who fully understand it. Pause. And you have reached that point. Your eyes dropped to the journal. Felt different now. Not heavier. Final. Like it no longer contained information, but conclusion. You opened it to the last section. There was only one entry. No explanation. No continuation. Just a single instruction. If the reader reaches this line with full comprehension, integration is complete. Your throat tightens slightly. Integration. Not survival. Not escape. Integration. Behind you, the figure spoke one last time. You were never meant to leave the castle unchanged. A long silence followed. Then, you were meant to replace the part of it that dies with each secret. The meaning hit slowly, not as fear, as structure collapsing into clarity. The king's words returned to you. Harmless men are trusted with dangerous truths. Now you understood why. Because harmless men did not resist becoming systems. The journal closed itself. No force, no hand, just closure. And in that moment, the castle above you seemed to settle, as if acknowledging a new alignment inside its structure. The storm outside began to fade, not ending, stabilizing. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was structured, as if the castle itself had finished waiting for your reaction and moved on to the next phase. The figure at the stairwell no longer felt separate from the room. Their presence had become part of it, like a fixed function inside a system that had just reached equilibrium. You understand now, they said quietly. It wasn't a question. You looked down at the journal, closed, no longer offering anything, not even resistance, just completion. Your fingers loosened slightly around it, but you did not let go, because letting go no longer meant escape. It meant removal. The king's voice came back to your memory, but now it felt distant, not as a warning, but as a transfer. You carry it until you become it. You finally spoke. So what am I now? Pause. The figure looked at you for a long moment, not evaluating, confirming, then transition complete. The words didn't feel like an answer. They felt like designation. Above you, somewhere deep in the castle, a bell rang once. Not loud, not urgent, final. The sound traveled through stone corridors like a signal passing through layers of a body that no longer belonged to individuals. The figure stepped back toward the stairwell. This time, they did not stop at the threshold. They simply faded into it. Not disappearance, reassignment, and you were left alone in the lower chamber. The journal in your hands no longer felt like an object with weight. Felt like a role, a continuity, a responsibility that no longer required your agreement. You opened it one last time. There was nothing new inside, only the first line you had ever read. If you are reading this, then the lie has already outlived its maker. But now you understood it differently. It was not a warning. It was a transfer protocol. The castle above you was still, not dead, stable,